Good evening, everybody. Good evening, all Mercian staff. It's a really great pleasure to welcome everybody to tonight's discussion with Tom Watson. Disclaimer, first of all, I've known Tom for many, many years. Hopefully we won't move off into anything other than what we said we were going to talk about tonight, but who knows how it's going to go. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Conrad. Good to talk.
Yeah, great. Tom, I've known you for years, but I still had to Google you. Of course I did. And and you've done a few things from this. And I just want to try and run a bit of sort of a bio of Tom Watson. So, member of Parliament, West Bromwich East. How long was that for, Tom?
Nearly 20 years, 2001 to basically to 2020.
Minister in the Blair government and whip in the Brown government.
Minister in both governments.
Minister in both governments.
Tony, Cabinet Office under Gordon.
Okay. Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport.
Yeah, that was a 5-year stretch. Yeah.
Deputy Leader of the Labour Party.
That was the same length of time, but it was a stretch as well.
Broadcaster, blogger, the first parliamentary blogger.
Yeah.
Rode the length of England.
Britain.
Rode the length of Britain. Sorry. How long did that take you?
About 3.5 weeks.
With Craig Charles, that must have been interesting.
Yeah.
In a boat.
It would have been quicker if he wasn't in the boat.
And recently elevated to the House of Lords. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Lord Watson of
Wyre Forest.
Wyre Forest. Tell us a little about why you chose Wyre Forest, Tom.
Well, I grew up in Kidderminster. I've lived in Bewdley, and the district of Wyre Forest takes in Kidderminster, Bewdley and Stourport. So it's home territory, really. But also in my latter years, I've come to appreciate how we live in a semi-rural area, and I've had some very great hours walking in the Wyre Forest, so it seemed appropriate.
And tell us, Tom, because we're a nosy bunch, teachers and stuff in schools, how do you become a member of the House of Lords? What did you get? Did you get a big golden invitation, or is it just a letter dropped through the post? Or
no, you get nominated by your party, usually in secret, and then you have to clear a security service investigation and an HMRC check. The Daily Mail have to write columns about it before it happens. Then you go to a committee that scrutinise your application. None of this you're aware of when it's going on. And then it has to be signed off by the Prime Minister and then the monarch.
And how long does that take? Well,
it depends, really. I mean, if the Prime Minister wants it to happen, it could take about 5 minutes. And in my case, it took about 3 years. So I don't really know, but it is quite a long process. Yeah.
But it is usual for deputy leaders of the Labour Party to go, former deputy leaders to go to the House of Lords. Is that
it's right? Kind of it is the usual thing to happen, but it's not a rule. It's a convention, and So I guess if you've had a senior level in politics and been around a while, it is more usual for that to happen.
Yeah. So now, Tom,
you're supposed to deploy your experience and wisdom to help in the next generation do the right thing.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about this is that I heard you say on a few occasions that there's no more ex-person than an ex-politician. So, is that dead and buried now, or are you?
Yeah, well, I am now. I mean, if you're in the Lords, I mean, it's not just politicians end up in the Lords. There's actually people who know what they're talking about. They've got scientists, lawyers, clerics, some very talented people, even former head teachers and teachers. You're pleased to know. If you fancy, I'll send you an application for one. But you're not making decisions in there. You're kind of helping legislators make better legislation. Yeah. That's theory, and that's really what I want to do when I get there.
Well, there you go, listeners. Anybody that fancies a stint in the House of Lords, write to Tom. He'll send you a form.
There is there is a route for people's peers, and there's the committee. I think every year there's two people can, you can self-nominate and be considered by the committee.
Well, that's got me thinking, but maybe not. Tom, we could talk for a long time, couldn't we, about your other work? You're a best-selling author. You've written 3 best-selling books now,
Yeah,
I believe. Dial M for Murdoch, The House, Losing Weight for Life. Have I missed?
there's one called Downsizing as well, which was another health book about how I reversed diabetes, type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. And we'll touch on that, but one of the big announcements as well that you made to the world last year, I think, was that you had undergone assessment for ADHD.
Yeah.
Just tell us, Tom, what made you arrive at the decision to undergo an assessment for ADHD?
It's a funny thing, that, Conrad, but actually, about 15 years ago, a very close friend of mine said that he had been going through an assessment for his daughter, and she'd been given a little booklet of questions that sort of talked about things at school, and the sort of the first sweep that people do to assess whether you've got ADHD. And he said, I think, why don't you just try and answer some of these questions, Tom? And I said, are you trying to suggest that I may have ADHD? He said, I know you have ADHD, but I think you need to find out for yourself. And obviously, I started doing half the questions, but because I have ADHD, I drifted off into something else and never did anything about it. But it did start a sort of period of self-reflection and analysis that ended up being a decade and a half before I finally got the recognition. But I'd got kind of telltale signs, for me, what I used to think was kind of slightly obsessional behaviour is actually a thing they call hyperfocus, which your colleagues will know about if they're involved in assessing kids. And hyperfocus is a bit. I mean, there's a lot of words that I don't think really describe the condition. But hyperfocus is really, some people call that a superpower because it means that you can really drill down into a particular thing for a long period of time and not lose your focus. But actually, the problem is what it really is an inability to balance your requirement to focus on numerous things. So, if I'm working on a document, there could be a cake in the oven, and 3 hours later the cake is incinerated. If I get distracted into something, you could leave, the dishes half done in the sink, or you're working on something for 3 days and then you realize you've not eaten for 36 hours.
Tell us, Tom. Obviously, you were a government minister. You had a high-profile job, high-profile roles. You still have, we can turn on the television and see you on Good Morning Britain and so on, and Peston and so on. How did you manage that on a day-to-day basis?
Well, good days and bad days, but essentially, I think what happens if you get a job where you can build teams, what I realized I'd done in life, well, it's particularly, you learn these things in hindsight, but I used to be very good at working with people. I enjoyed the company of people, and I built teams. And what I'd found I'd done, I tended to bring in people into the team who were completer finishers. So I could obsess on a bit of work. I could enthuse about something. I could generate ideas, but I needed someone with me who could help implement that. And in politics, politics is what you're always on projects. You're running a by-election. You assemble a team and you deconstruct it again. You're setting up a campaign. You're making this argument here and there. You're on a committee trying to sort of solve a problem. And so what I'd found was the sort of world I was in naturally allowed me to sort of build teams on that. But in my early days, when I was in more junior jobs in politics, it was agony. I mean, I was actually the deputy general election coordinator in 1997, and that I've got memories now of that every day being highly anxious because of just the throughput of work, and the tasks I had to do were not, not really matched to the condition. So there's a whole load of software, the project management software, which in those days was pretty rudimentary, but it used to really, I used to fail every day at trying to map out that level of detail. And luckily, I got to a point in politics where I could find the people with those skills and help them on that.
So is it fair to say you developed a sort of strong set of sophisticated masking techniques to compensate for some of those challenges?
Well, sort of masking is where you kind of hide your deficiencies. I mean, and what I essentially did was, without knowing it, put some external scaffolding around me that allowed me to compensate for the deficiencies of what I now know and didn't at the time. Is a neurological condition. It's the parts of my brain that allow working memory and executive functioning are different to others. That's why you're neurodiverse. Your brain's wired a little differently. And that's really it's, you need a sort of diagnosis to sort of try and understand that, because what I used to find was I couldn't understand why there were things that other people used to do as just part of everyday life that I failed at all the time. And yet I could, so for example, you very often didn't finish all your tasks or complete them. You'd start all of them. You'd start 30 projects in a day, and by the end of the week, only one of them would be complete, or none of them. So I had this really, I used to think that I was naturally lazy, and that this is quite common with people with ADHD. In fact, I thought I was unique. I used to describe myself as the hardest working lazy person I've ever known, because I was doing 7 days a week, 18-hour days, literally flat out. But enough, I didn't finish anything, and so those self labels you give yourself are really powerful. And actually, I mean, perhaps for the audience that listen to this, what you don't realize when you get a diagnosis, an assessment in adult life, I wasn't really prepared for how understanding how those self labels had come about was actually really quite traumatic, and it brings back all sorts of sort of traumatic childhood sort of memories that were really difficult at the time. And it takes me back to 3G, class 3G at Sladen Middle School, where in the space of a month I lost my SMP maths book 3 times. And I loved Mrs. Green, and I craved her recognition, but she just really ripped my head off because she thought I was being lazy because I'd lost these maths books, and I couldn't understand myself how I'd lost these maths books. I was completely anxious about it, to the point of trauma, really. I mean, it sounds silly describing it now, what went on in life, but it then kind of, you develop a kind of a sort of false narrative around why that happened. So my false narrative was, I'm challenging the system a little bit. No one's going to tell me what to do. If I want to lose my maths book, I will do. And within about 6 months, there I was, wanted to succeed, studious when I could be, changing that label, and being and it kind of that sat with me throughout adolescence and throughout school, and throughout life, really, my early 20s.
When you received the diagnosis, obviously you've put yourself forward for assessment as an adult, in midlife, not as a younger adult. So you've lived with the condition, you've created the conditions around yourself to be able to cope, manage, function at a very high level and demanding level. But when you received that diagnosis, I presume I don't know too much, Tom, about the actual process of diagnosis. You might want to talk about that, but it's a clinical decision, and you received the diagnosis. What was there, a feeling of relief? Were you overwhelmed? Was there, do all these ideas of being back in 3G, did they come flooding back to you immediately? And confirmed it wasn't you, it was your condition and so on.
Yes, but by the time I'd gone for a diagnosis, and you need a psychiatrist to do it.
Yeah.
It's in that realm.
Mm.
So it's not easy to, there's a lot of hurdles you have to go over to get it. But for me, it was probably confirming at that point what I already knew. And by then, I'd used the powers of hyperfocus to read up a lot about ADHD and what it means and what so it kind of, but it kind of just encouraged me to sort of take a different journey. And I mean, critically, what a diagnosis gives you is the ability to be titrated with medication. And some people choose to use that when they're adults, and some don't. But it also starts you on a path where there's psychoeducation, and a lot of this is sort of embedded in the sort of CBT area, cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's such very practical things you can do when you've got a neurological condition that affects your time management and your working memory. And so what I found very helpful is just how you do your lists, how you remind yourself of things. And one of the practical things I do, I've got those little tiles that I attach to keys and
Okay.
wallet and in every bag. Because there's very often people with ADHD, they describe a thing called ADHD tax.
Okay.
The cost of your working memory letting you down. So if I told you that the number of cases I've left on trains and never found is in double figures, including last month where I lost another suit and a set of earrings for a birthday present that cost a lot of money, that I'd not made it to the recipient because the birthday isn't for another month. It's those sort of things that just sort of how you can live a sort of practically effective life better, that allow you in adulthood to do that.
And how have you decided to use medications yourself? Have you, or are you?
Yeah, I mean, the process is, I mean, again, in adulthood, it's a long process because you have to monitor your blood pressure, and there's all sorts of things you have to do, and you start on a low dose and track what the effect is. And for me, it's a very subtle effect. You wouldn't say you feel physically different, and you wouldn't say you feel tangibly cognitively different. But what I know is that I get more domestic chores done if I take if I take effectively Ritalin. I could certainly plow through admin things like accounts and invoices, or if I need to finish a chapter for a book because I'm on a deadline, I can focus more on that particular task without being distracted. So I don't use medication every day. Some people do, but I tend to use it to assist me to be a more productive person.
And do you recognise now when you're in that zone, you're in that attention, hyper focus?
Well, I definitely know when I'm obsessing on things, and I also know when you kind of say things like my ADHD is rampant today, where it's hard to just keep the day running. And there's a thing with ADHD, it's called, it's difficult transitioning from one task to another. They call it transitioning. So, you could be, when I was a politician, the first thing I'd do in the morning is check the media brief in my emails. If you're having a bad day, 2 hours later, you could still be responding to emails. That's just set off a chain of events. You forget to get dressed to get the bus to work. So I kind of know when I'm, when for whatever reason it is, no one really knows this because the research is still, poor, but or not complete. But I know when I'm having a bad day, and it tends to last a couple of days. Now, of course, what the diagnosis also helps is historically, your inner voice, there's no one more critical of people with ADHD than those people that have it. And you tend to punish yourself, and a lot of people have low self-esteem, because they feel like they're failures and don't understand why. And what the diagnosis helps you to do is rationalize all of that. So the one thing I hope it's given me is I'm much kinder to myself. Some would say it means I'm less driven.
Mm.
I sometimes think, I'm too chilled out for politics these days. That's probably because I'm being kind to myself. That kind of,
Yeah.
there's a whole series of
There's a calling. There's a calling coming out, Tom.
yeah.
Tom, I was just gonna wonder in terms of decompressing. Now, we have many students who are neurodiverse, and they go into higher arousal states, and we're always seeking opportunities to reduce that high arousal. And
Yeah.
sometimes those students they don't admit it in school. We
Yeah.
don't see it. You don't see it as a behaviour, but often the behaviours happen at school. Sorry, at home. They parents will contact us and say they must have had a really bad day because they've come home and they're in this condition, this state. We're finding it difficult to move them to a lower arousal state. I'm just wondering what you used to manage that. I mean, one of the things I forgot to say was you're chair of UK Music, and I'm just wondering, music has been a constant in your life. Have you got go-to things that will just allow you to decompress or bring you down?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I'll say, because of the age cohort you're dealing with at school, just to say, I'm much better at it in adulthood than I was in adolescence, and that's partly because you are neurologically developmentally behind as well. So you are emotionally dysregulated more of the time when you're an adolescent, and that's because your brain isn't quite, it's still growing. But I sometimes think people forget that. So
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the latest evidence around brain elasticity is that the brain is still in development up into early adulthood, 24, 25.
yes, yeah, very much. And for someone with an ADHD, they very often say that if we've got ADHD, your sort of emotional regulation has not reached maturity until you're 30. So I mean, I guess so. There's, in one sense, that means you've just got to wrap a strategy around that, because that's a physical thing. You can't do anything about it. It's not a behaviour thing. The kids just can't do any different. But for me, a lot of people with ADHD self-medicate. They'll drink too much, or they'll because part of the condition is their relationship to dopamine is different. They produce less dopamine, so which is why they tend to be slightly reckless or impulsive, or it can lead to being reckless and impulsive. And I over time I found great refuge in music. I found and actually the physical health journey I went on in my early 50s really helped me. So there's a very strong research now that physical exercise can have a very tangible cognitive benefit for people with ADHD.
At your heaviest, what roundabout were you?
Well, at my heaviest, when I weighed myself, I think I was heavier than this. I was 22 stone.
Yeah.
And I lost 8 stone, and I did it to combat type 2 diabetes. But actually, very early on in that journey, where I've had, I think I had most benefit was cognitively. My mental acuity sharpened. I found myself focusing more on things for longer, and so there's obviously some kind of neurological relationship between.
But I also remember in conversations with you went head first and dived into body hacking, into all that type of work, the bulletproof coffees.
Yeah, I mean, in a funny sort of way, that's. I mean, I don't like using that term superpower for hyperfocus, because it is more often than not, it's a curse. But it's occasionally useful. And what I did was dive deep into how you regulate insulin in your body and how you could do things like that, and sort of read, pretty cutting edge research that really helped me. And also, helped me talk about public policy a bit in that area. And so it can be, I'm not saying that, the trouble with hyperfocus, just now that we're on it, is, you could spend 3 years investigating phone hacking, living it you know, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, which is essentially what I did. For 3 years, I couldn't do anything else. I was hyper focused on that for a long period of time. But you can equally get obsessed with a video game.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if I look back at my life and think of the times I've, you know, dawn is broken and I'm on a PlayStation 2 on a video game that the kids had left on when they went to bed, and
Yeah.
I'm still playing it. So there's things like that I guess now that I've got more awareness, I genuinely try and avoid those temptations.
So I'm just wondering then, have you managed to sort of find a healthy balance? I'm thinking you were overweight, created challenges in itself, high profile job. You have a discussion with yourself or clinicians around weight loss. You then dive into that, and your weight loss becomes quite dramatic. Well chronicled. We know about that, but coming out the other side have you managed to stay with that? Have you got that balance in all these areas now, or is it still a challenge across the piece for you to not become hyper focused on a particular thing?
I think anyone with ADHD can never land it perfectly. I'm definitely more balanced. I definitely have techniques for dealing with the condition. You know, I've definitely got support networks that are important, and I'm much better at spotting when I'm heading in those directions. But I mean, you know, I don't know whether that's because I've reached a state of emotional maturity later in life, or whether I find techniques around it, or a combination of both.
More reflective, maybe.
What I do know is, you know, in my early 20s, I didn't have the cognitive bandwidth to understand how I could bring myself down from, you know, a hyper, you know, a hyper focused state. Or, you know, there's another thing with ADHD. A lot of this is actually slightly less chronicled, but I think the next time, there's 3 subcategories of ADHD, or it's broken into 3 subcategories. Again, your colleagues will probably know this. There's the hyperactivity one, and these are the kids that are sitting under the desk, you know, playing the drums when they should be, you know, reading in a book. But there's also the ones that are quieter, where they're, you know, essentially drifting off into a world of their own. That's the one that I've got, and that's harder to spot in a classroom, because you have to deal with a kid that's going ballistic in the classroom. But the one that's sitting at the back of the class, thinking about the world around them but not doing their work, they're easy to miss in a busy classroom, aren't they? And then there's another category where you've got the combination of both. Where there's a big debate in research around the area, there's all sorts of associated conditions around it. One of which I think will probably get its own category, which is this idea of rejection sensitive dysphoria. And why I think that's important is, I mean, what you know, you may say to a child, you've not completed that task, and what they're hearing is you saying, you're a complete failure, I really don't like you, I don't approve of you, and they're just overwhelmed. And I've certainly had periods of life that on reflection I look back at, where I've just felt completely emotionally overwhelmed for things that are really tiny in everyone else's life. And you know, we all have that. You know, I'm not just saying it's just people with ADHD, but I think it's particularly it's a particular feature for many people with ADHD, and they talk about it. The reason I'm raising it now is I think for kids it's less known about, but it might stimulate some thought. Colleagues who've got kids in their classes that sometimes have that.
We'll come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to ask you about, you've raised some important issues about comorbidity, associated conditions, and so on. But there's also familial history.
Yeah.
And have you seen anything in your familial history around ADHD, or be it undiagnosed, or things that you now reflect on and have seen that?
Yeah, so I mean, depending on the books you read, but people sort of talk about it being 60% genetic, 40% epigenetic, and that is certainly the case in my family. I think I probably come. I'm absolutely certain my late father had ADHD, and I'm absolutely certain he medicated with alcohol. And I've got nephews and nieces who have been through a diagnosis recently, and are displaying all the signs that they've got ADHD in a classroom setting and in a family setting. Where I think it's harder is kids that have not got support networks around them. It must be agony for them. They don't know their condition. They've not got support, perhaps we're used to, and they've got, they don't understand what's happening to them. So it will be very, very frightening, I think. And they're the ones that you see who are in a constant state of hypervigilance, and their triggers ready to go, any slight or any perceived slight. And I would imagine, if you're an educationalist, it's really hard to reach them, because you've only got to make a mistake with them twice, and you'll never get them back.
I mean, you'll be pleased to know progress has been made. I mean, you and I are fairly similar age group. You're slightly older than me. I'll just drop that one in. But we both would have gone through our primary school and high school without a designated person to work with neurodiverse conditions. Those neurodiverse conditions would not have been known about. They certainly wouldn't have connected with schools. There wouldn't have been that pastoral support. There wouldn't have been teaching assistants, and that whole infrastructure around it. You would see now that if you walked into most schools, the challenge I think we've had in schools is the external capacity to be able to keep up with the referrals that we make into clinical process and so on. So the challenge often is that but good assessment is crucial, and we're constantly talking to staff about what our assessments need to be and what they need to look like. I'm just thinking back now in school, what sort of things would you have needed, do you think, that we're missing?
Well, again, I just want to be understood. It's a sort of commentary, isn't it? I think I mean.
Well, was it care and compassion, or was it a particular curriculum strand for you that would have supported you, or what would you think?
Well, I mean, the carrot and the stick is the wrong description, but for me, what people with ADHD need is constant reassurance, and they need feedback loops where there's praise. They're not going to deal with the stick very well. It's not going to get them to do what you want. So there's a sort of recent thing I've got now where one of the ADHD kids in my life ended up, what would you call it, on report, where if they're late for lessons, because they're time blind, so they're constantly late for lessons. And one of the things that every teacher needed to sign was complete every task. Complete your task in lessons. That's not a smart measure, but it's also, an ADHD kid, it's like computer says no. So I just think, it's more carrot and stick required, and I know I can imagine how hard it is, because I mean, you've got to be really patient, haven't you, with kids? Well, I do my head in.
Do you think there's room to be probably a bit more holistic around this work, in that, particularly when teachers are in training, maybe those clinical inputs into training, that to make it more a joined up approach, so we gain a greater understanding of not just conditions, but also hear from the voices, the lived experience?
I think the lived experience is important, because it's a frightening place when you don't know because you don't know you're essentially different. You feel different, or you feel an otherness with ADHD, but you can't define it. There's things you can't do that others find normal, and it's very disorienting sometimes, and it's sometimes quite a lonely place. and you know, for a child, it's also frightening, that, isn't
Yeah.
it? So just understanding that is the start of it, I think. I mean, and the other thing, I mean, there's a bit of taboo around medication. You know, the prescribed drugs for adults, and they are you know, I forget what. And so not to be frightened of medication or having kids on medication. I mean, I guess if you're a teacher, you know, you'll know if you've got kids on Ritalin when they don't take their Ritalin. You'll know when they're not taking Ritalin because they're out of
Yeah.
control.
Yeah.
What I now know is I wouldn't have lost my maths books, Mrs. Green, if I'd have been on Ritalin, and I've done all my homework on time. And sometimes I used to get A pluses for the homework that I used to really like doing. But if I couldn't focus on it, I didn't do it. So writing in my report, as Mrs. Carhill did in 2C, works well when in the right mood, was factually correct, but not particularly motivating.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. And
my old teachers.
I mean, there's always this question about labelling as well. I mean, the common refrain about labelling is that if you rely on a label, you're not treating the child, you're not treating the condition, you're just looking at the label. You've decided to obtain a diagnosis of ADHD and be very public about that. What's your view on whether we should go down that road with younger people, children and adolescents? We should encourage a diagnosis and then obtain the label. Is that
Yeah.
something,
Well,
or is it really something that you make a personal choice on?
I think you have to I think you have to get a diagnosis if you suspect a kid with ADHD, because you're going to help them to learn better, either with medication or with psychoeducation and with techniques. I mean, a lot of this is in the territory of coaching as well. I should have said that at the start. You know, like, so I know, you know, some of the kids in my sort of family network, they've had you know, that a kind of mentoring where for half an hour a week, you know, you get a Zoom call, and it's, you're right, how many pieces of homework have you got to do this week, what are you doing in your social life, what exercise are you doing, you know, to help them get a balance and plan out their week. And that's really important. So getting kids from A to B in a school, you know, the ADHD kids will get into the classroom and remember they've left their books in the locker. They'll run back and then get distracted, and then 10 minutes later, they can't help that. That, you know, they can't estimate time like others can. That's part of the condition.
So really, it's about sort of investing your time, investing in understanding and developing that understanding of the individual themselves, not just the condition as well. I think how that condition provides the barriers to them.
You know, things that would really frustrate me if I was a teacher with a kid that regularly comes in 5 minutes late. Your default position is this kid is defiant, and, you know, or just not bothered. But actually, they don't know any better. They literally cannot not be late, or they cannot control they've just got less ability to do those things that others find basic. And just knowing that and being chilled out about that in the way the school ethos and rules are deployed, I would say, is half the journey.
Yeah.
I don't know.
How are your young your members of your family coping? Have they had a diagnosis, or were you going through an assessment at the moment?
Yeah, I've got a niece who actually, which is wife I'm talking to. I'm quite up close to it at the moment. Who's going through a titration process. So she's had this, and they've had conversations with the school, and you know, like all these things, the school have responded well. There are individual issues that everything needs to be joined up. But it's sort of made me think a little bit about, you know, we really, just like so many things going on in schools these days, there's not enough support, is there? There's just, you know, I feel for everyone, because I know how under pressure everyone's been. You've had 2 or 3 years of COVID. There's a whole load of things going on, with public sector cuts along the way. I don't want to get like a politician, but you know, so then have some idiot come in and say, actually, what we need is a huge lot more support with ADHD, but I just think there needs to be more external support,
Yeah.
because actually, this is a productivity issue for
Mm.
the country. I mean, if kids are not getting, dare I say, a sort of wraparound, they're not
Mm.
going to school, they're not going to be productive
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but the percentage of people in prison with ADHD is dramatic,
Mm.
and there's a whole load of social policy conclusions you can make from looking where people with ADHD end up.
So do you think this figure of 3.4 million adults is a underestimate, gross underestimate?
I don't know. I don't
Mm.
know. I mean, there's definitely underdiagnosis. I mean, there's
Mm.
been a rapid increase in recent, just because awareness is raising.
Yeah.
There are a greater number of adults getting later in life diagnoses.
Yeah.
And I think, that in a school setting, schools are much better at sort of engaging earlier on in a child's journey in life, aren't they? But there's still quite a long way to go.
Yeah.
Um, but I and I guess it's not really at a school that what you probably need at authority level is more support, where bespoke support, where experts can help across a school or an academy group.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'll be pleased to know that within our trust, we've got our own clinical team.
Well, that's fine. Yeah.
We've got a couple of 2 speech and language therapists, 2 occupational therapists. We've got musical therapists. Also, as well, we have clinical students in practice, ranging from nurses to OTs, speech and language therapists. Because you're absolutely right. One of the challenges we faced, Tom, was the length of time from referral to assessment.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but for things like ASD, for example, the assessment in some local authority areas can be up to 4 years. So you've got 4-year length of wait while you're trying to do something with a student that hopefully you think is right, but you haven't got that clinical direction quite often. And that's something that we attacked head on, So there is some progress.
Well, I mean, that's cutting edge. I mean, you should be very proud of that, because you'll know there are other parts of the country where there's no one's anywhere near that level of support. And there'll be a lot of kids benefiting from that, I would imagine.
I think what we've done, we've managed to bring those services closer to the kids.
Yeah.
And that's where you see the difference, because I mean, I'll give you an example of the way we're using therapy dogs. For example, we've connected with clinical services through our clinicians, and we're now using therapy dogs with clinicians, where the therapy dog can give feedback to the clinician on the challenges that the pupil's facing. I mean, that is cutting edge, isn't it? And that's cutting edge of the things that the NHS are doing, but we've managed to join up with. So it's not just the fact that we've brought in our services, but we're connecting much better now with services. And quite often that appears to be the challenge, how the services connect up. Sometimes there can be a service there waiting for you, but it's connecting up with it. So hopefully that's what we will be able to show, that where you get groups of professionals talking holistically about a young child or young person, then the action can happen much quicker. So hopefully in wherever your niece is living, that they've got something similar happening for her. That's a challenge to them.
I'm not just in case any of her cousins watch this, I'm not going to geolocate her.
No. Tom, I'm going to thank you for our time today. It's been a really interesting insight, particularly around the lived experience of ADHD, as you now know you've had diagnosis, but you've lived with, and you've talked so openly and candidly about ADHD and living with it, what it's given you, the challenges of it, and moving forward with it in the future. So thank you very, very much for your time tonight with us.
Thanks, Conrad, and thanks for asking for my insight. I'm still on that journey, but it's really encouraging to hear that you're taking this on at a really deep level.
Thank you very much, Tom. Brilliant. Cheers. Good night.
Yes, all the best to you.